Asia's economic growth is expected to bounce back in 2023. That's according to the International Monetary Fund's latest economic forecast for the region, which will grow more than 4.5% this year. The fund cited China's recovery for its more upbeat assessment. The reopening of its economy has fueled the turnaround, with consumption and service sector demand leading the way. The IMF added China's growth, along with its Asian neighbours, will be a boom for the global economy.
It means that Asia and Pacific is driving global growth. The countries in the region are combined to account for about 70% of global growth in 2023. This is a much larger share than we've seen in the past few years. And just two countries, India and China, account for about 50% of global growth.
But the fund also warned that the global economy still faces risks from inflation and market volatility due to banking sector woes in the US and Europe. Finance ministers from South Korea, China and Japan held a trilateral meeting in South Korea on Tuesday. It comes on the sidelines of the Asian Development Bank's annual meeting. Jack Barton has more from Seoul.
It's the first time the finance ministers of China, Japan and South Korea have met since before the pandemic began, with South Korea's finance minister saying the meeting focused on what he described as creating an engine for speedy and sustainable recovery in the wake of the pandemic. In a joint message following the meeting, the ministers of all three nations said they recognized the importance of strengthening economic and trade relations to secure post-pandemic growth, minimize any lasting negative effects, and prepare for future shocks, saying deeper cooperation in investment, trade, finance, and even tourism, now countries are opening up again, would be pursued.
세계 경제가 중요한 변곡점에 있는 상황에서
the trilateral cooperation between South Korea, Japan, and China has become more important for these three countries of ASEAN Plus 3 and also for the world, as the global economy stands at an inflection point.
The three nations make up about 20% of the global economy and 80% of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations Plus 3 gathering. The ministers also discussed ways to boost the size and effectiveness of the Chiang Mai Initiative multilateralization, a $240 billion currency swap arrangement between the ASEAN Plus 3 nations launched in 2000. On the same day, Japan and South Korea's finance ministers also held their first bilateral meeting in 7 years, as the two countries try to restore ties following a diplomatic turned trade war stemming from unresolved issues surrounding Japan's colonial-era occupation of the peninsula. Jack Barton, CGTN, Seoul.
Joining me now to talk more about the prospects for growth in Asia is Dan McClory. He's the Managing Director and Head of China for Boustead Securities. Dan, thank you for your time. Now, the IMF predicting Asia Pacific will contribute 70% to global growth is remarkable. What's behind the improved forecast for the region?
Well, I think it's a COVID comeback, probably in both markets. It's certainly the Indian economy trending towards their population scale. But more than anything, you're starting to see the reawakening of the consumer in both of those economies. It has helped China in times of economic challenge before, and it's really going to be imperative for this next go-around.
So people essentially are buying more, but what is it that they're buying, and how are they buying more? Why are they doing so well? Why are people in China consuming more than in other countries?
Well, there's certainly been pent-up demand. After COVID-0, you could just imagine how people wanted to get out there and try to get back to as close to normal as possible. But remember China's influence. That consumer in China now is once again very mobile and is going places and spending money. And that big sort of under-recognized export of tourism is also fueling the growth in some of the other ASEAN economies that are frequent destinations for Chinese.
So is inflation not affecting those in China and India like it is in the US and Australia and in Europe?
It absolutely is. And if there's a moderating influence there to these somewhat buoyant growth numbers that we're hearing about in the last couple of days, inflation has to be brought into check. Monetary policy has to continue to be supportive of bringing inflation back into check. Otherwise, people just aren't going to have the purchasing power to consume.
Now let's talk about, the Asia-Pacific countries that have been downgraded: Australia, New Zealand, Japan, Singapore, and South Korea. Talk to us about why those countries specifically don't expect to grow in the same way.
Well, they have somewhat anemic growth rates, as you're alluding to, by them being included in that particular group of sort of the lower squadron there. I think it really comes down to most of those economies had their COVID comebacks, and so they maybe burst onto the scene. They hit a bit of a stride, but now, to points you made earlier, they're beset with inflation. Some economies like Australia have had a resource-dependent economy that continues to have ups and downs. So it's a variety of factors, but I think it's primarily due to the fact that they really have kind of gotten the burst of their COVID comeback, whereas China is still coming up from that, and it's helping give them some bit of tailwinds. And
certainly the travel and consumption during the May Day holiday helped, no doubt. What about the trickle-down effect? Are China and India's neighbours going to be benefiting from this boost?
They should, but if there's, a cause for observation, if not concern, in China, it's got to be manufacturing. Again, you and I have been talking for the most part about consumer spending, inflation, things of that nature, but the manufacturing index is down. That is in large part due to the countries to which China and to some extent India export to, and those economies facing their own challenges. So it creates headwinds going back into China and India. So I would say we moderate a little bit this growth narrative with some of the reality of a manufacturing slow growth.
From what I understand, the travel sector has been slow to recover as well, international travel particularly being too expensive for a lot of Chinese travellers. What are some of the potential challenges in China's recovery moving forward? Is this a kind of, a high that many people are experiencing in China for now? Will it plateau and even off?
Some of it is, but I would say, and again, we haven't touched on luxury goods spending in China, which has caused outsized results for all those large international luxury goods companies. But remember, it's not just about going into a retail shop. It's now this whole online experience of, I bought something that was really important. I filmed myself unwrapping it, putting it on, demonstrating it to my followers. And the intrinsic value that comes in those kind of purchases, which may seem to be over the top, they may seem to be excessive, don't underestimate the value of some of that driving things like the luxury goods sector.
I'm glad you mentioned the luxury goods sector. We'll have a whole segment on that later in the program with another interview, so appreciate that tease there. But let's just finish off finally. The Asian Development Bank meetings have begun this week. Any expectations there?
Well, they're trying to ensure that there's a unified front because there's so much bilateralism taking place throughout the world. So they want to have a unified front. They want to be able to help raise each other up and not have it come down to superpowers with geopolitical tensions and strains that are so prevalent in other parts of the world. So you're seeing a coming together, and you heard about an example of Japan and Korea actually on the sidelines are actually going to dialogue. So I think you're going to try to see a strength and a unanimity and an increased and enhancement to the supply chains that many of those countries share. So they're not just going to sit around and wait for the rest of the world to get their act together. They're going to do something about what they can do now.
All right. Thank you. Dan McClory, Managing Director and Head of China for Balstead Securities.
Thanks, Sally.